Well, recently Samsung announced the S22 Ultra, and thankfully we got it in the studio a little bit early. So I took it over the weekend and I wanted to test it against the iPhone 13 Pro, which in my opinion is kind of the gold standard when it comes to smartphone cameras at the moment. So without further ado, let's just see how it did. If you want to see, I'm going to leave the specs for the Galaxy here. So I'm going to start off with a comparison of the 13 Pro and the S22 Ultra. But if you want to see just the S22 Ultra results and some photos I took with it just by itself, you can just jump to the timecode down below. So let's take a look at the actual two cameras side by side. Now, I took this to a music video shoot that I did over the weekend, and I wanted to test out these cameras in more challenging scenarios. I think every smartphone camera nowadays looks good when you shoot it outside in daylight. So I took these inside in a dark room. So I think that's really going to put these sensors to the test. So let's have a look. I'm using Lightroom to show off both these images as it's sort of a neutral ground for the two of them. If I was to look straight using just Finder or Preview on the Mac here, it would process the iPhone photos to be far more HDR. We don't want that. We want this to look we want this to be as neutral a test as possible. So we're just going to use Lightroom. Starting off here, we have the S22 Ultra and the iPhone 13. And I think immediately off the mark, you can kind of see where the S22 Ultra, I guess, maybe struggled with exposure somewhat. It's keeping everything nicely and well lit. These lights are blown out in both photos, but that's kind of what to expect as they are just bright lights. But if you are to look right around the artist's face here, it's definitely overexposed. Now, I'm not going to look at focus too much because the two cameras just seem to focus at different things, even though I took these photos at the exact same time. Overall, sharpness is looking good. That is kind of what I've come to expect on the regular cameras. Interestingly enough, the iPhone does come across darker, but still it preserves all the details in the subject and everything around it. So, you know, I think when it comes down to it, it might just be a personal preference in terms of which you actually prefer. In my opinion, I do prefer how the iPhone looks, but that's not to say that the Samsung looks bad in any way. I think it really just kind of pushes the exposure and really tries to get the most out of the scenario that you're kind of trying to shoot. Looking at the shadow though on the photographer here on the right side, you can see that totally just falls to darkness on the iPhone, which looks okay. Whereas on the Samsung, it's really trying to process that shadows and lift it to the highest to get the most detail out. And you can see a lot of sort of macro blocking and artifacts here where it's trying to show detail where there just isn't any. And I think that really is kind of to the detriment of the Samsung because it just doesn't end up looking that good. But anyway, let's move on. We're going to look at the ultra wides here. The iPhone has a 0.5 camera, whereas the Samsung has a 0.6. Very comparable. We have the Samsung here, iPhone here. Overall, these look nearly identical. They're both 12 megapixel sensors. I'm seeing a lot of just artifacting in the corners where it's trying to bring out detail in both cameras. Overall, very nice though. I like how both of them look. Now let's look at some video. We're going to start with the iPhone 13 Pro here. This is all 4K, regular frame rate on the regular camera. So let's just take a look. So initially I think this looks good. It's doing a good job preserving a lot of the colors and detail. The playback isn't totally smooth. That could be a Lightroom thing or the phone itself. But I think in general, so let's look at it again. I think it's good. You're seeing a lot of detail, especially in the roof here. It's not being lost due to the exposure of these lights blowing anything out. It's a little noisy. That's not too bad. But overall, I think this is quite an accurate depiction of how it actually looked on set as well. So let's look at the Samsung, see how that does. And initially, you can see the Samsung's classic, just kind of sharpening at least. The image as a whole looks a lot sharper, but it's sort of in a post-processing kind of way. Let's watch that again. You can see the exposure actually. If I jump back here, you can see a shift in exposure, which we didn't see so much with the iPhone. This is okay. This isn't exactly anything against the Samsung, but yeah, I guess it's just how this, the actual
that you had your
processor is looking in comparison. Looking at the artist's face is what's coming out the most interesting to me initially. The Samsung is looking a lot more saturated, which they're kind of known to do. And it's looking just a tad noisier. If you're looking at his shirt here, you can really start to see some of that fine grain that's coming through. And then let's look at the photographer's face here as well in the corner. You can see there is quite a lot of detail it's picking up on, especially in the turban and the beard. And going back to the iPhone, you're getting the same amount of detail, but it seems like the iPhone is just slightly pushing those highlights just to make that image pop a little bit more. Overall though, both of these just look great. I'd be happy with either. Let's move on. Okay, so, all right, we're looking at the 3x telephoto on both cameras here. And I think you can see they struggled. This is a very challenging scenario for these cameras especially. Hey, it is Robin from The Edit. I just wanted to say, because I noticed it very clearly with this one, I took these photos at the exact same time. I pressed the shutter at the exact same time on both. I just held both phones right next to each other. I think the reason that the photos look so different is that there is a split difference, or at least a little stutter between the Samsung actually, when you hit the shutter, and it taking the photo. So these photos are being taken from the exact same moment in time. It's just that the Samsung has a slight delay. So anyway, keep that in mind. That's why they look so drastically different. Okay, let's get back to it. And you can really see they're kind of, both of them are falling apart. The iPhone totally struggling to get any sort of exposure, so you can see it's lowering the shutter speed. He's looking blurry. Samsung's looking better, but then it's just that little bit more dull. So what can you expect? All right, let's move on. I think at this point, night mode is one of those things that just is across the board just going to be good on pretty much every flagship smartphone out there. Really, when it comes down to this, we're going to look at the iPhone here, and then here's the Samsung. I think this is just totally down to personal preference. Looking at both, the iPhone is getting actually a lot more flaring coming in the top corners here. The Samsung's a lot neater. You have one flare in the top corner where there was another street light overall, but you can see again, like I mentioned, the iPhone's doing a lot more to just bring that overall exposure down, whereas the Samsung's trying to lift everything. This is good if you like to edit your photos afterwards, because with the Samsung, you're getting a lot more flexibility. You can pull that exposure down. You can do what you like. With the iPhone, unless you are shooting in their Apple RAW mode, this is baked in. You're not going to be able to bring out any of the information in these shadows as much, say, as you could with the Samsung. So if we look at the apartment block, for example, just down here in the middle right photo, the Samsung is 100%, let's zoom in there. The Samsung has preserved a lot of the detail going on by these windows, whereas the iPhone is doing more to just bring down and just preserve more so the highlights and just getting rid of all that detail. I think because of the way the iPhone's doing this, it comes across as a little sharper. I don't think it really is when you look at the actual details, say when we look at the ground. Well, let's flip back and forth. Well, actually, it is a smidge sharper. I think a lot of that has to do with the fact that this is actually also a more contrasty image. the way the iPhone has processed it. Despite the iPhone having significantly less megapixels, which the Samsung is for the last few generations really pushed their higher megapixel sensors, the image processing on the iPhone definitely gives it the appearance of being sharper. And similarly, again, we can see this is the end of the shoot, packing away. We've got the iPhone here, Samsung here, and you know, I prefer the way the Samsung has done it here, just because I do like the fact that it's preserved some of the detail in the shrubbery behind. Whereas on the iPhone, it's totally just disregarded all of that. The Samsung has sort of overblown this tube light here that's kind of lighting our scene, but because of that, it's kind of lost some of the saturation in the image, in the details here. If you look at the reds specifically, like in the one in the case here, the one in the rear light, the iPhone's doing a lot more to really preserve that saturation. But I think mostly this is a personal preference kind of thing, because you can bring this into Lightroom or edit it on the phone itself, and you can just bring that saturation back. I think because of the angle, these were taken side by side, two phones in hand. I think it's just because of where this light is on the Samsung that it's kind of flaring out more, whereas you can see it's kind of behind his head in this one. Let's see. Both cameras do a very good job at edge detection, but the Samsung's a little bit better. Samsung's definitely a little bit better. It's a little bit cleaner around the hood, the shoulder here. When you look on the iPhone, there is just some gnarly ghosting going on right around his. Look at this, actually. That's some. Yeah, so it's kind of picking up on that edge light there, not really sure what to do with it. And so you're kind of getting this ghosting effect, whereas this is really clean looking on the Samsung. Zooming in on the face there. You can see, again, typically the iPhone's just doing a little bit more processing to keep a lot of that detail. All right, and then this is the best part. This is gonna be looking at the selfie cameras. So this one here is the iPhone. Let's take a quick look. And this is really quite contrasty, surprisingly so. Doesn't look bad, but I think because of that kind of contrast, it's bringing out a lot of saturation in my face, and you can really, really see those red undertones. So let's see what the Samsung. The Samsung is like just a little bit more neutral. Yeah, you can definitely still see my pale pink Irish skin, but I kind of prefer how the Samsung's doing a little less processing here. It has the classic kind of Samsung sharpness, but if you look at some of the details in my cardigan, it looks quite natural here on the Samsung, whereas the iPhone's really trying to push those highlights, bringing them really, really high up. And it's kind of just washing out the rest of the image. You can see I'm losing detail in the hair here. The skin, there's not as much different, not as much detail. Yeah, Samsung's not doing as much to push that exposure. In terms of clarity and I think true to lifeness, I think the Samsung wins. At least in this front-facing video. And again, this is both 4K, both 30 frames a second. Yeah, it's interesting. The iPhone there's, yeah, it almost looks like I have some kind of Instagram filter already applied. Okay, well, that is the comparison segment. So I think the Samsung, again, year after year, they have put out great cameras in these phones. At this stage, it's pretty much apples to oranges. It's personal preference. If you're an Android person, I think the Samsung is a great option. I think comparing against the iPhone just does well because the iPhone sort of sets the bar. It is the gold standard when it comes to smartphone cameras. But the Samsung, it's nothing to fool around with. This is really, really punching in, well, I say in its weight class because these are pretty much in this exact same weight class. But again, Samsung, great job. Let's have a look at some of the individual features itself that can't really be compared to the iPhone. Samsung really boasts their 108 megapixel mode. Now, it's a separate selection in the camera app when you're choosing it. It defaults to 12 megapixel by standard. So I wanted to actually really see, is there a big difference between 108 megapixel and the standard 12 megapixel mode? Because there should be. So let's start out with the 108 here, and I'm just going to flip over to the 12, and flip back. Funny enough, you can tell it's 108 megapixels because it takes that split second longer for Lightroom to catch up and really get the full resolution. Immediate first impression is the 12 megapixel, to me, I think looks better. They're definitely doing more in terms of processing here, in terms of pulling sharpness, adding contrast, saturation, things like that. Whereas with the 108 megapixel, it's a lot flatter, a little bit more dull. It's got a lot of natural sharpness. First look, it just kind of comes off looking a bit dull. Let's zoom in here though, because I think that's really where we're going to see the difference. So with the 108 megapixel, you can just keep zooming. Like all this writing here, this text is totally legible. Pull across, you can see the birds, you can see the buildings in the distance, detail in the wall. It's really, there's a lot here. Whereas if I float over to the 12 megapixel and try zoom in, you can start seeing it fall apart. You can see this. It almost looks like a cartoon. It's blocky, the detail's not there. It's just the resolution. It's what you'd expect from 12 megapixels, honestly. But that being said, how often are you doing this? I'd tell you, never. I don't do this with my own photos. You really gotta ask if you'd use the 108 megapixel mode, when you'd use it. I think maybe if you were trying to take some kind of vast cityscape image and you want to be able to zoom in on all those little individual details. But other than that, I say save the space on your phone, use the 12 megapixel mode as standard. It's a nice party trick, the 108, but I don't really think it's worth using. Now, the 10 megapixel mode. Interesting enough, man. Samsung have really done a really great job with these other zoom lenses, because each one definitely has to be processed differently because they're all different sensors. But there's a uniformity across all the images that really, between the different zoom levels, makes it look very, very consistent. And then just for fun, here's some of the 100 times zoom. Maybe if you're taking a hike and you want to really zoom in on something. But again, it's totally usable. And that's the director mode. Now, we saw this introduced with the S21 Ultra last year. And I had some fun with it, using it, but I could never really figure out a time or place when you'd want to use it. Similarly, it's the exact same features. They haven't added or retracted anything from last year's. And what frustrates me about it is that I like the concept. I like the idea of being able to use both cameras at once and being able to cycle through the different cameras all within the same recording. But for the life of me, I just have no idea when you'd actually use this. Because you can't just, to my knowledge, you can't live stream with this. You could take maybe Instagram stories if you want to show yourself at the Eiffel Tower and then also you looking at the Eiffel Tower or something. But for the most part, I just can't really think of a reasonable time when you want to use this feature, despite the fact that I like it so much. That's kind of everything in the S22 Ultra this year. There aren't a ton of new features like we saw in the S21 Ultra. They've kind of just kept it consistent, which you can't be mad at. These cameras are great. And well, I'd be excited to see what they come out with the next iteration. But hey, that's it. If you thought any of the cameras looked better in particular, let us know down below in the comments. I'd be really curious to see if you preferred either the iPhone or the Samsung. Let us know what you think of the Samsung images in general. Do you like them? If you have an Android phone currently, would you switch to the Samsung just to get these different cameras? And other than that, I hope you enjoyed this video and I hope you think I did a good job. My name's Robin, and if you want to like and subscribe, I'd really appreciate that.